Okay, it looks like we are. That's that's great news. Good. All right. Well, thank you folks so much for tuning in. I am excited to be bringing you what looks like episode number 67 of Talking About Horses. And in this episode, I'm joined by Mr. Paul Belasik. Paul is a highly respected international rider, trainer, writer, and teacher, an avowed proponent of classical equestrian ideals. He's published 8 books, I believe it's now 9, on riding, including the perennial favorite, Riding Towards the Light, and also a more recent, Dressage for No Country. What we want to talk about today is the most recent, Long and Low, a revolution in modern dressage. But first, Paul, thank you so much for joining me here for an episode of Talking About Horses.
Well, thanks, Patrick. I was thinking, I have to say that I think it's always a danger in talking about a book that one has written because, when you're writing these things, you're all by yourself. You go over every word, 50 times. You've gone over the thing. It's taken months and months of practice. And then even you have professional editors check on it, even so it's better. So you have presented the most eloquent you can be of an argument. And then you start talking about it to people and you mumble through the things and you get confused on what you were talking about, the quotations, and you think, oh my God, I did all this work and now I've completely disappointed everyone. So I will just preface this whole thing with, an apology ahead of time that I hope I don't disappoint your viewers as we talk about this new book or anything else really that you want to talk about.
Oh gosh, well that's great. No, I don't think we have to worry about disappointing anyone at all. And if nothing else, in the end, we're going to be talking about horses, right? And how can horse lovers ever be disappointed with a conversation like that?
Right. I'll interrupt once. I've said this before, but I was just talking about I had to do this little talk for some people. And I was telling people, I don't think that the people that we as horsemen, just because you bring it up as we're talking about horses, realize how amazing it is what we do. And I've said somewhere before, you see these videos, people go to Florida and they get in a pool somewhere and then they let them hold the fin of a dolphin and they have an out of the body experience. They think, my God, this is the most unbelievable thing. But we ride horses every day. And it's like, there are only a couple animals. Maybe you can ride an elephant or a camel, but you can't dance with any of those animals. It's only this very specific species of animals that we communicate with, and we don't even do it with words. And somehow we've evolved over thousands of years to have this very tight relationship and this almost magical phenomenon that you're riding this 1,000-pound animal that has the potential to really, it could do anything they want with you, but we don't, we get around it. And I just think sometimes riders have to stop and just what you said and just think about just how amazing riding is, whatever you do. So
it's an incredible honor, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. That's, and the argument, the horse does all the work anyway. So
yeah, right. Yeah. I don't think I would be that tired after my riding today if that's how it really went.
Right, exactly. I was telling a student recently that it should be hard like chess, not hard like digging a ditch. But at the end of it, both of them can be as exhausting, right?
Yes. Yeah. I don't think, there's always that misconception. And it's the same with people who really don't understand dance or have really seen it backstage in a ballet, what is involved in it. I mean, if you're coming off all of your riding and you're never perspiring, you're probably not doing it right,
Right. It can be, almost scary for riders to realize how hard you need to work in a lot of different ways, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily the grunting and straining and that sort of thing, but you, like you said, if you're not sweating a little bit at the end of your ride, you probably aren't doing much up there.
No, I mean, sometimes too, and as you just kind of almost alluded to, sometimes the hardest thing is, what we're supposed to do, the better we get at it, is do less and less, or at least look like we're doing less and less on top of the horse. That becomes a lifetime to just a practice to be able to sit still and yet still accomplish something and be communicating. But now you can't do it by jostling all over the place. And so sometimes the hardest thing is that almost that isometric exercise of being, being able to communicate, but yet you're being still. It's very hard to do. It's like, I get a kick out of people who go to the gym and they plank for 30 seconds and they think it's just a wonderful thing. The dressage rider is planking for 45 minutes per ride, the whole time.
Right.
Talk about core strength.
Exactly. Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that not just the planking, but the ability to look still, right? And
Hmm.
I know that you've got some experience with martial arts, and one of the things, I'm not very experienced with it for certain, but I have a good friend who I believe is a 5th degree black belt in Tai Chi. And one of the principles that he always talked about, he used to teach at some of my clinics over lunch break for the riders, Tai Chi for the riders. And one of the things that he would always talk about is how in movement there's stillness, and in stillness there's movement. And that's something that we always try to think about, right? When we're riding and when we want to look like that centaur, right? Or that, center pole of the carousel horse, or whatever the picture is that we have in our mind that looks like no movement. There's a lot of movement taking place in
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I know exactly right. That's the art form of it. How do you really, when you admire some of those riders, and some of the really good ones, riders of Spanish riding school or anywhere in the world, and you just see leg is still, it's quiet, and now the horse is doing these amazing things, and you just wonder how is that possible? That rider is doing nothing, and
Absolutely.
that's the kind of the magic of it.
That's it. Exactly. Exactly. One of my mentors years ago, Mark Russell, who set me on a path of dressage and learning deeper about how the horse functions, talked about when he was with Nuno Oliveira, watching Nuno ride a horse just at the walk, and how soaked with sweat he was when he got off of the horse, and said it's incredible how hard walking is.
Hmm.
When you in that, if I understand it correctly, if I remember the story correctly, it was a story about really helping a horse to find the balance when the horse wasn't naturally balanced, and how much work there was to help that horse find that balanced walk and look like they're not doing anything.
Yeah. I think one of the amazing things about dressage is that in the beginning, of course, no, you're learning your seat and so on. You don't feel this and see this, but you're always there's these cliches all the time in the literature that you want to become one with the horse. Uh, and in the end, when you start to do really the high level movements, to take something even like a levad, there in a lot of these other movements, if the rider tips way over, you're not going to be able to knock the horse down. The horse is really secure and strong. But when you get to something like a levad and the balance gets really
Mm,
precarious, then there the rider had their previous center of gravity or center of balance, the horse had its, but in those movements you really become like the centaur, you become one. And so if the rider moves drastically, they can knock the horse out of balance and ruin the movement. So it's sometimes in the beginning, people think that, oh, it's why do I have to be so perfect? And it doesn't matter. You don't have to think that you're going to do a levad. But the thing is, you need to learn, if you need to learn the fundamentals correctly from the beginning. Otherwise, you're going to put a ceiling on your riding, and you are not going to be able to advance beyond a lot of things. So the reason for good fundamentals is not because one day you need to ride airs above the ground, but it's because it will become integral to the quality and the level of your riding from the beginning to the end. It has to be done
mhm.
right from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Or at the very least, you're going to be working too hard, or confusing the horse, or, just not able to accomplish things well if you don't have that background, you know,
Yeah.
really
Mhm.
that foundation really installed there.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So for listeners that aren't familiar with you, Paul, that maybe they haven't read your books, tell us a little bit first about who's Paul Belasik and why horses.
Well, okay, I'll try to. I think I was born into a family in the city where I was an anomaly, that I was just one of those animal crazy kids from the beginning. They tell me stories about it before I had any realization of it. But I was
So
in
you got the
trouble.
genetic mutation for
I think so.
horses.
Yeah. You know, and so I had an aunt who was in the Navy and she was a nurse, and she had gone to nursing school with another woman who was a nurse. They were good friends. And this lady had married a farmer up in the Finger Lakes area in near Lake Seneca. It's a gorgeous place in New York. And they had a beautiful Victorian house in this gorgeous farm. And she used to tell me, look, when you're 12 years old, basically, you be a good boy. I will set you up that you could get to this farm. And they had horses, and it didn't hurt that this farmer also had two beautiful daughters who were a little older than I was. So I tried to be a good boy to get to that farm, and I did get to that farm. And the man, Chick Lynn, was a great mentor of mine, and he was the person who got me really interested in horses. And his daughter rode as well. But the big thing I think about that is that I really fell in love. I was hooked on the country life. I I just
Mm,
couldn't take the city really anymore. I knew where I was going to be happy and what really fulfilled me and so on. So I went on with my education, got all the way to university and started in a pre-veterinary program. But in over the years, switched to another passion almost. I kept the same passion, but another passion was writing. So I became involved in a creative
Mm.
writing program there. And so I finished, graduated, and then immediately got a job in a horse job which is another story in itself. But I went right into the horse work. In the daytime, I was doing horses. In the evenings, I was doing writing. So I was writing poems and poetry for small literary magazines and even a magazine like Rolling Stone. And on the other hand, I began to write small articles for horse magazines. So I remember the first ones I worked with was for the Chronicle of the Horse when the legendary editor Matthew McKay Smith was editor. So he told me, Paul, I like your writing, but look, we have space limitations here. Can you keep the things short? And I said, yeah, I was, for all the young writers who are listening to this, it's like, you may have to adapt your skills or your style to get something done. So I did. I wrote a lot of short pieces. So I was doing the writing as well as the writing. So I was writing short pieces for magazines and still some poetry for the literary magazines. And then I was sort of developing these two classes of friends. I had these artist friends, and I had these I had artist friends, and I had these farmer friends. They just didn't seem to ever meet. The artist friends thought the farmer friends, the horse people, were just farmers. The horse people thought that the artists were snobs. And I was just finding always a way to smooth this out in my own mind, how to make these two passions
How
coexist.
to
And
integrate.
so then I came up. I was just going to write a book on riding. I was sticking to riding all the time, and really into at that point still in the German system. I was standing 3 Trakehner stallions for a couple in New England, and was really doing a lot of work with training for the young stallions for approvals and so on. And anyway, I began to work on that book you mentioned, Riding Towards the Light. And
Mm.
so I knew I had all my heroes had been published by J.A. Allen in England, and that was a publishing company that I really admired, and I wanted. I thought if I was a horse, I would not be in that stable. Those people know what they're doing. So luckily, I sent the manuscript there, and Carolyn Burt worked there at the time. She was the sort of managing editor and so on, and she was a champion for me. That book, I don't think that book was what they were used to, but she thought it was worth publishing, and she really helped me out a lot and pushed me along. And then it turned out to be pretty responsive. People seem to like it a lot. So that was kind of a little bit of the history. And then from there, I just continued writing books and trying to explain problems that I was encountering as a professional trainer. And I was teaching all the time and training. And then it went on, as you said, from one book to another, from different competitions, and then working with all kinds of different riders in all kinds of fields. But that's a little bit of the history. I think a side note to that, I was thinking about that when I was lucky enough to live in a place called Chad's. I started in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, but then it was really close to Unionville and Kennett Square. Well, in Kennett Square, the University of Pennsylvania's veterinary hospital has their horse center there, basically, and their teaching hospital, and that's where they do. It's outside the city there, where they have all the students come and the young vets learn about all of the things about large animal veterinary care and so on. Well, there was a library there. It was only 3 miles from my home. And I remember it was a one winter night. I'm researching one of these books I'm writing on, and I walk in this library, and I'm going over to the modern section where the shelves are, and there's all these magazines, every kind of magazine from all over the world about the current scientific study. But I look on the other side, and there are these glass bookcases. They're enclosed in glass doors, and I look in there, and I looking at the titles, and I'm thinking, my God, what? And I see Garnier, and I see all these really rare books. So it's quiet at night, nobody's in there, and I talk to the librarian. I say, what's with this whole collection here? And so he says to me that it's a famous collection. This famous Philadelphia guy, Fairman Rogers, had this amazing equestrian collection, and he donated it to us. So I say, can anyone look at it? And he said, yeah, nobody looks at it. Let me see if I can find the keys. So he goes there hunting around, and finally he finds the keys to the things, and he just gives me the keys. And now I'm like this kid in a candy shop. I have every night anything available to me. If you probably could find the log back in that library and you look October, whatever, 1977, Paul Belasik, and there's no other names there. It was just me
Wow.
after myself, they would allow me to take these books not out of the library, but I could put them down, read them, and oh,
Mhm.
the bibliophiles would go nuts. But there was even a Xerox machine there, and you could even I didn't do this, but you could turn the books over and Xerox parts of it. But so I had that library available to me. So it was just incredible. I mean, there are not libraries like that. There aren't many in the world like that. So that
Right.
was
How
part of it at the
fascinating.
time, part of my education, because I was always interested, not just the physical parts of writing, but like Podolsky would say, always the theory. And so I
Mhm.
had this amazing opportunity right at my doorstep to be able to learn from some of these masters. If they were in different languages that I didn't know, I would sometimes get my friends to come who did know that language, and then they would, translate for me and so on. So that was all part of my learning process that I was really interested in the, in the learning, the book learning part of it, as well as the training. The training was going on every day, the hard work of riding horses, taking care of horses, and all of that. But that was part of my, my upbringing in the horses, and part of, how I started,
Mhm.
and why I to this day have such an interest in the classic literature, and still love it. So
Yeah.
that was just to give people an idea of where I was coming from. That's kind of where I was coming from.
What an opportunity to have access to books like that.
Well, I'll tell you, to go on with that story. I don't want to take up all your time, but so one day I went in there, and it was, this is before your time, but there were card catalogs. They were these
Okay.
little boxes. You know what I'm talking about? And you would pull
Absolutely.
them out, and
Yeah.
they had these little like 3x5 cards of the
Mhm.
titles of the book, the author, and so, and where you could, what section, SK 149. You would go there and
Yeah.
find the book. So one day I went in there, and I was looking for, I can't remember. Let's just say it was Pluvinel. It was a book by, Pluvinel's book. And I go to look for it, and I find it was in the library before. I had seen it before, and I go there, and it's missing. And so I had actually talked to Caroline Burton. I said, what would that, what would that book be valuable? What would the value of that be? And she
Mhm.
was kind of chuckling, thinking that I was going to buy it. She said, Paul, I don't think you'll make enough in your royalties we have one, but I don't think you can afford it. And I think even at that time, it was like, I don't know, 13,000 pounds or something, like
Oh, wow.
$26,000, whatever,
Yeah.
something like that. And I thought, well, I better tell them that it's missing. So I told the librarian that it was missing. And then it was not long after that, the University of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia took all the books. They moved them all downtown, and now you really couldn't have access to them unless you were a real scholar, or you had some special permission. Now, I'll bring this up because I find this is a current problem that could become worse, because it's this business of somebody capturing information and then not letting it out. So now, okay, the University of
Mhm.
Pennsylvania took these books, but in many, many cases, what collectors are collecting these books, they know nothing about the contents of these books. They put them on a shelf somewhere, like some painting that they just hoard, and they keep it up
Mhm.
in value. But that information, it's not on AI. They haven't gotten to that. All right.
Yeah.
You
Right.
can't find that information. And now, if it's
Mhm.
hidden in a library, in somebody's library book, and it's just collecting dust, you find yourself, you don't have access to this information. And that's really disheartening if you're somebody who wants to learn, or you're a scholar, or you just, like I did, you just got in there and wanted to learn from those people. So I think
Mhm.
that gets to be a complicated subject, the whole thing of, controlling information,
Mhm.
and then also, but protecting it as well. So one last part of that story was, a few years later, I made a small film. I forget the title, the Kyoto, Lost
The
Kyoto.
Lost Coyotes.
Lost Coyotes, yeah. And I
Mhm.
wanted to use some of those books. So I called down
Mhm.
in Philadelphia, and I said, is it possible to use some of those books? The filmmakers would like to film them. And well, I had to jump through all these hoops. And then they said, well, what do you want? Pick like 3 books. That's all you're going to get, Paul. And we'll bring them out. And the librarian brought them out, and it was, she had white gloves on, full,
Mm.
and she brought them out. And you know this because you're in this field, but filmmakers, they don't do things once. They want to do it, so they wanted me to
Right.
open the cover and close the cover open. And now I see
87
her
times,
boiling
right?
on the sidelines there, saying like, that's enough. Don't open that cover anymore. You're destroying this. So I'm like,
And
okay.
these were the books that you used to have access to just sit
I
down
used
on
to
the
pull
table
out
or
on the
take the
table, right, and
Xerox
have a
machine.
candy bar, and sit there for hours on end, or something reading. But
Yeah.
so that there it was, and she literally, she let us use them for a couple of times to look at the three of them, then put them, folded them back up, put them in a special carton, put them in a special container, dried them all the way back to Philadelphia. And I just thought, man, how things have changed, and how lucky I was to have access to those teachers in such a, it's just serendipitous way, So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I really like what you brought up. Like when collectors have these books, if they're not doing something to help share the information, right? Something that Charles de Cunfee used to say is, he would talk about, and I'm going to botch it, I know, but he
yeah.
would talk about how the art is preserved through its most recent living practitioners. And if we don't have access to the theoretical knowledge like that, the art is really only one generation away from dissolving.
I I think that's, yeah, I would say that's a pretty accurate statement. And if we can go on, and we probably will go on a little bit later when we talk about what's happening in the modern writing. It's kind of the almost the same process in the reverse, that you've
That's
limited
right.
the amount of good information, and the result is you have a whole culture of the next generation who know nothing about it. I mean,
Yeah.
and then it can be a disaster.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing Charles would say, is that the writer without theoretical knowledge is an unteachable writer,
Yeah.
right? Which I think makes a lot of sense, and it's exactly what we're talking about here. The ability to, the opportunity, the ability to read that theory, to read, here's where all of this came from, and that's something that I think, Paul, you've done such a fantastic job, and I've got all your books stacked here. But I recommend them to everyone. I'm just going to brag on you here for a moment for the social media world to hear, but your writing style is fantastic. The way that you put the information across is digestible, easily digestible, and yet you can pack all the theory in it. So thank you for your writing style with that. Um,
You're
and
welcome.
you put that in all of your books, and in all of them, uh, it's easy to tell that it's you in the way that you write, in the style that you write. So that's really great to hear, or to be able to read. um, and yeah, it's just without that knowledge, without having that as a background, we won't know why we're doing what we're doing, right? And then there's so much less value in that.
And the thing is kind of what you were saying a minute ago too, is what Charles said and so on. But how are you going to create a culture of younger people who will want that knowledge? Because sometimes
Mhm.
it gets very disheartening, because I'll talk to young people and they're competing or doing this, and then you'll ask them, who was a Pluvinel or whatever. They have no idea. But what's most disheartening is, I don't care if you're ignorant about the subject, but if you don't have no curiosity as to what is that guy talking about, or what could Pluvinel be talking about that might help me, that's the disaster. And that's the sad part,
Mhm.
is that, as you said, then the well dries up, and then you can lose the loom. You can burn the house down and the loom goes. If somebody, long as someone has written it down or knows how to weave, then we can still weave. We can make another loom. We can weave. But if somebody forgets the whole art of the weaving, then they look at the loom and it's just a dinosaur. It's an artifact that looks pretty, or I like to have one and make it into a planter. They have no idea what it was used for. So you have
Right.
this knowledge is, it's useful, it's usable, it's as important as a saddle or a bridle.
Mhm.
It's part of the equipment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good analogy too, the loom in that. That's a great one. I like that. Yeah. So, well, let's dive. Well, no, before we dive into that, I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about all your travels in learning. You didn't just sit in the library to learn.
No.
You went off all over the place, and I really like the your next most recent book, The Dressage for No Country. I really like how you broke that down by the schools that you went in, and uh, watched riders and rode at yourself and things like that, and through the essential book, there was quite a bit in there as well about all of the different places that you traveled, the lessons that you learned. And what I loved about that, especially the horses that you learned from and those lessons. Talk to us about the traveling. Why were you not just happy sitting in the library learning that and then riding your horses at home?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do, I often say that I don't feel that was naturally really a born like a lucky person. I've never won a lottery or anything like that. But I think where I have been really lucky in my life is whenever I've wanted to learn something, when it was poetry or something, that I found the most amazing teachers, some like incredible, national treasures to help me out. And when I really was wanting to study dressage and really learn more about it, I ran into Henry von Schaik, who was a legend in our time, lived up in the middle of nowhere in Vermont. And it was about 5 hours from my farm when I moved into the Adirondacks. But von Schaik was an amazing teacher. He himself had won the silver medal in the 1936 Olympics in jumping, and then really turned his love to dressage, which he would say that he wanted to do he wanted to ride and do it in some form that he could do forever. And he knew he wouldn't be able to jump forever. But von Schaik was really erudite and had a mind. If you would sit down with him, he was 80 years old, and in 5 minutes you would think you're talking to a 20-year-old. He was so much fun and so inquisitive and so sharp and bright, and he was the one who would, not only myself, there are so many that he would really inspire. He would take you in his library. And I remember he had like 2 leather chairs, and you're this ragamuffin sitting there, and he's this, famous person. He sits in his chair. You have the identical chair, the same kind of chair. And then he asks you questions, and he didn't suffer fools. So you have to study your work. But what he did, he would inspire you. And then he would pull a book down from the shelf and he would tell you, you would say, well, I think this is great. He'd say, oh yeah, you do? Well, you don't really have that quite right. And then he would tell you, but so he himself traveled all over the world, and he would go to Europe every year, at least once, almost all his life. And he said, I have to refresh my eye because there wasn't anything I can see here that will really help me out that much. So I would say that he was the one who started really influenced me into telling me about, you're going to have to see the other schools of riding, and you're going to have to know where they are and what are the great representatives of them. And then I began to read and study, Pignatelli from Naples and so on, and then realized that there were, the Iberian school, probably the French school, the Austro-Hungarian school, German school. Those, I figured I had to at least get experience from those schools, and I really probably needed to, do it from the horse's mouth and not just, somewhere vicariously. So, and that's how I didn't have tremendous resources to travel, but so I would work and work and work. And then if I had some time, then I would travel. Now, I think one of the first things was I had been involved in the German system because, again, by kind of dumb luck, a couple in New England had brought over Trakehner horses from Germany. This was in the 70s. And I began working for them. I was a young trainer. It was a great opportunity. And in a few years, I was standing 3 Trakehner stallions, and famous German riders would come over to their house, whatever, and then they would give me lessons. And I was really pretty indoctrinated in the German system. But after about 10 years of that, I thought, look, I don't mean to sound like smart aleck, but I had enough. I had come from an education background where it was, critical thinking was important, and you had a mindset of to being open-minded and to study, not just to study one parochial thing. And so that's what I decided. I had to broaden my education. And so there I thought, and I had my first wife at the time had studied in Ireland with Ian Dudgeon, and Sylvia Stania used to be the teaching there, and she wrote this little book on lunging. And I thought it was really great. And she had, had this reputation of working for the Queen of England. So this, was really good. And she used to talk about this guy, Nuno Oliveira. And I thought, well, I think I need to see this. Now, the funny thing is Von Schaik told me, no, don't do that. He said, this is probably too personal, but he said, I'll give you a letter of recommendation to go to von Neindorf's, but, I already knew a bit of what von Neindorf, he told me I had seen special videos of von Neindorf, and I knew what kind of von Neindorf was about, but I didn't know anything about what was this, this Nuno Oliveira about in this kind of school of riding, And so that was one of my first trips. And I went there for not that long, but a few months. And I wrote about it in one of my books. We don't have to say anything disparaging about Nuno, but I mean, obviously he was a phenomenon and an amazing person, in spite of himself, I guess you would say, or whatever, but still,
Right.
very knowledgeable about horses and riding. And I mean, for someone like, I'm always marveled at him, for someone who English was not his native language, he had these great quotes all the time, and I just thought, how does he pull that stuff out? He's not really a writer, but he was really good at it. So yeah, I did that when I came back from there. That made a huge influence on my riding, and it seeped in too, because then I had my first experience with those Iberian horses, and I thought they were amazing horses. They were smaller, they were very intelligent, and the fastest reflexes of any horse in the world, But I was training at the time. I was training, a lot of my customers were women. It's just the way it was in America, and they were riding these 17 hand warm bloods, and they were getting hurt. They couldn't. These horses were they were big and strong for me to ride when I was in my prime, and I just thought that they need these horses. If they could only ride these horses, they would feel collection. They would see these horses were so smart, but they were docile. They weren't aggressive horses at all, And I thought this would be a thing for the future. It took years then, but then I did acquire an Andalusian stallion, and I began at first just to breed crossbreds because the bias was so strong against the Iberian horses. If you took them out in a show, it would be ridiculous. But if I was,
and it feels like it's still working to get that changed. In a lot of circles. Yeah.
Sure. So then I would, half breed them, and then finally, now it's, yes, as you say, it has turned around quite a bit. You have a horse like Fuego, and the whole world is in love with them. This is an amazing creature. But anyway, that was part of the education there. It was not only the riders and the training, it was encountering those horses. I thought that these are amazing horses, and then it was, so then it was also to work with some different people that I didn't really, not in France, but worked with different French trainers and so forth. And always in the back of my mind, every time I kept coming back to the Spanish riding school, I would compare where I was to what their work was. And I thought, it's better. It's better. They're doing everything better. Their position is better. Their horses, they're not these crazy movers, whatever, but they're better in the piaffe. They're better in the they do straight changes. They do these amazing things, and the riders do it, without, a lot of brutality and so on. And then finally I had a chance to go to Vienna and spend some time with Artur Kodas there. And that was amazing in itself. And I'll tell you just a small story about that, because just to show maybe some of your viewers who think, oh, well, Paul's led a privileged life and he gets to meet all these people. Well, it wasn't. I mean, I worked really hard and these things sometimes took years in setting up. And actually, it was Charles de Comfy who helped me, because Charles sent a letter to Kodas that, and said that, Paul would like to come or whatever. I thought he just filed it, just threw it away. And in fact, it was almost a year later. He calls me up, and one day I'm out riding, and my wife says, Artur Kodas is on the phone. I said, no, come on. She says, no. So he says, look, I'm really sorry, but I saw your letter. I had lost it, and I saw it's a year later now, but you are welcome to come, and I'll, help set things up for you and so on. So it's all set up. It's amazing. I go to Vienna the night before, and I'm actually like, it's such an amazing city, and I'm like really on edge to meet these gods of riding. And so I go. I don't really know to go in the head office, so I go around. And if you've ever seen their videos, you know how they'll walk the Lipizzaners across the roadway under this bridge. Well, when you get to the doors right there on the other side of this bridge, they open immediately into the Spanish riding school. There isn't even like a vestibule. It's like, you're now performing from the street, you perform. So I'm there, on this sidewalk, it's a dirt sidewalk. And all of a sudden the door opens and out walks Klaus Krisch, complete uniform, whatever. And I look at him, and he's one of my favorite, still is one of my favorite riders of all time. Amazing rider, I think, and he looks at me, and I think he must've sensed, it's like a duck out of water. What do you need help? And I said, well, I'm supposed to meet Herr Kodas, and he says, well, come with me. So we go in this side door, and now we go through the bowels of the Spanish riding school. We're on like the other side of the kickboards. There's all of the piping. There's the, the
Yes.
furnaces, everything. And we're going, and it's it's a long arena. We're going for like a mile through this
Yeah.
labyrinth, and
You're in the inner workings of it there.
yeah, and
Yeah.
he's just marching through there. And anyway, we come up the stairs into the office, and now the beautiful office, and it's all the books and this
Mm.
grand carpeting. And I see Carlos looks over, and he just turns white. He looks like, "Where did you come from?" And and he looks at Chris like he said, "What did you do? Bring this guest through the back door like that?" And he just looks at me quietly and says, "Mr. Belasik, he said, next time, please come through the front door." But that was my first introduction to Spanish riding school, and it's
Quite memorable.
yeah, and it kind of fits my life. It's like I learned a lot by sometimes coming at it through a back door or at least a side door. There weren't
There you
many
go.
grand entrances from the front door, but
Right,
that
right.
was a true
But the key
story.
piece is you got in, right?
Yeah, I think was I got in and then had an amazing time. Yeah, and the last day I remember, we were sitting. He said, "Look, I have to leave for a clinic, but the performance was on a Sunday, and the last day I was there." And he said, "So come to this little diner. It was like a diner." And he says, we have breakfast there together. So I go in there, and it's like, if you were a Lakers fan or something, here's all of these famous riders, and I see them all. There's one, they're reading the paper or whatever. So I sit with him and we chat, and so then he gets a little sort of personal. He just says, we everybody thinks this job, that I have is like so great. He said, but it's like being, the manager like of a really famous soccer team. These are all big egos, and to
Mm,
wrestle them and to, I've got to tell this one he's got to lose weight, this one. And he said, it's a bit of a lonely job. And I felt really touched by it, and really, also saw the humanity in what they were doing, that in the end, they were just people, but they were very good at what they do,
mhm.
so that wasn't, so when we're talking about travels, that was an amazing, amazing trip. And it sort of brought things together again for me. And over the years, it was always the system that I really stole from in terms of my own training. It's always been based on that. I had seen other schools of training. I had seen, the long and low, the deep riding, but it just it couldn't get the results that I really wanted, that I was looking for.
Mm,
And so I would just read, about their stuff, and then the problem with a lot of those things is that, like, the directives of the Spanish riding school are only a couple pages. There's not very much information. So it's almost all oral history. So you have to have someone help you out to try to tell you how that system goes. But again, there was a lot of traveling. There was also, and those then it was clinics all over the place in Europe and in Canada and all over. But that also, through that traveling, was what then began to incense me, because I would be traveling to these places and go to these prestigious stables and see Olympic riders and ride, 5 horses in a row, all in draw reins, and I just thought,
mm,
this is not making sense to me, so
mhm.
that was part of it. So the travel was, it was very educational.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It could be easy to get disillusioned in seeing a lot of that, particularly if you didn't have the background and the I'll call it the flavor, right? The flavor that you knew you were working toward, what you wanted to feel, what you wanted to see. And then so traveling like that, you can see where this isn't lining up with what I'm aiming for.
Yeah, yeah. And then the other thing would be, and it goes all the way back to, we can talk about it along a little bit, but it goes back to Seeger, who's complaining
Mhm.
about Bochet, and Seeger's one of the few people who actually, Bochet, he knows Bochet. He's read his book, and Bochet even invites him to sit on his horses. So he's ridden his horses. He's seen him train personally, and then he's aghast at the disparity between what Bochet is writing and what's really happening. So there's a case, hundreds of years ago, same thing keeps happening.
Mhm.
Sometimes you get charismatic people with a real gift of, speech, and they carry people along. But it's hard to really investigate and see is what's really going on beneath the surface. You almost have to be in the club to really, to know what's going
Mhm.
on.
Well, Paul, I think that that's a really perfect segue for your new book, Long and Low. And my reason for thinking that is it's first, it's such an easy book to read. I actually read it just this past weekend at the horse show in 2 sittings. Was able to read through it, and it's great. It's really great. But one of the things that really stood out to me, and maybe this has happened in other books, but maybe I didn't notice it to the degree that I noticed it in this case. It felt like you were pulling Seeger and Boucher and Steinbrecht and Garnier together to the same table and saying, look, guys, let's talk about this stuff. Like, I really felt like the way that you presented the information was the integration there. It's like we kind of got an inside look at the good old boys club, kind of in the way that, we just mentioned it, where you get to see, or you get to understand who was really learning from who at what point over here, while what's this going on over here, and who's learning from who, and where are they sharing. And I really think that this book, you packed a lot into this little book, in the way that you were able to tie all that together. So kudos for that. That was really a fascinating read.
Well, thank you. It took, it took a lot of research because some of the things were quite obscure, and but in the end, what you're really counting on, because these people are dead, and and there were no video cameras at the time, is you have to rely on their writing. So the good thing is that basically Seeger, he told you, he said it. All you have to do is read his book. He said it. Steinbrecht said these things. So sometimes you have to read carefully and read between the lines and so on. But if it's like sometimes if you read enough of an author, you get their biases and you can overlook them, and you can see what, a lot of times what they really meant. So, being someone who likes to read and has always been fascinated with that literature and has been studying it for a long time, it wasn't hard, for me to do the research. It was really enjoyable, but there were pieces of it that were really, they were hard to uncover. It was hard to see where did this come from, this long and low business? How did it start? Who started it? Why? And there wasn't a lot of information. You have the German cavalry, but there's small rules. There's not a lot of description in there. And then I came upon this book by this guy Gordon Schwabel von Gordon, and he said he was the last living representative of the School of Hanover. And then I thought, this was amazing, an eyewitness account to some of these things. And then I would begin from there to draw into other, people to validate or disprove what I was trying to say. And then I could try to make it into a story, but it only could come about because, those people already wrote something, they wrote something to tell you, how it's done. All you got to do is read it,
Right.
you're going to get the information, But it's not going to be easy all the time. You got to find those books, and you got to read a lot, before you find. Sometimes nowadays, I read a whole horse book and get nothing. And then I read one and it was worth it because there was one line in it that was just fantastic, So
Absolutely.
that's okay with me. That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and like you said, being able to read enough of it to learn to read between the lines, right? And then to be able to find that puzzle piece. Where does that fit with the other things, right? And how does all of that kind of amalgamate into, as you said, the story, right?
Yeah.
And the what's really going on all at once, right? What's going on all at once. So the new book, Paul, Long and Low, A Revolution in Modern Dressage. I'm going to recommend it for everyone because it's just such a great book, well written, easy to read, and like I said, packs a lot of information in a short book. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about Long and Low. First, I guess, how would we describe, for those listeners that maybe aren't into dressage riding, what is Long and Low? What does that mean?
Well, what it is it means that I'll start from the beginning. So I said in the beginning of this new book that it's up there in the shelf. I can find a book by 30,000 years of horses, art and horses on. There's sculptures, there's paintings, there's cave drawings, there's tapestries, whatever. 30,000 years. And you cannot find one in the whole of the relationship between the two species of human beings and horses. And you can't find one instance of a horse being ridden with its head down. No one has done it before. And then, so in my travels, I seeing Spanish riding school, seeing the Iberian Peninsula, seeing horses in France, and knowing the history of it, coming down from Renaissance Naples, classical masters were not doing that. So now in the 1800s, all of a sudden, somebody's riding these horses with their heads down, and to the point where it's described. Schwabel the cavalry school says that what the horse must do is on insistence from the outside rein, it must lower its head down to the ground as if it were searching for truffles. So it's lowering its head down. Now, at the same time, you have a description. Podhajski talks about this. Baron Beal writes that he's looking around the schools in Germany, and it's abomination that all he sees is these people riding horses with their heads down, twisting the necks from side to side, and so on. And he said he goes to Vienna to find some other way to riding. So how does this come about? Well, the military, they didn't have an interest in really high school dressage. And I think the easiest way to come about this is you can look at the schism in Germany at the time between somebody like a Steinbrecht and somebody like the School of Hanover, because that's where this was an offshoot of, this is the Long and Low is an offshoot of a very small subset of riders in the military, in the German military cavalry, who decided that the horse is important, that the horse ride it down long, down deep on command. Now, it wouldn't take much imagination to see, if you were teaching people to take on the outside rein and make the horse's head drop down, that this could easily deteriorate into pulling the heads around side to side, whatever. Even though those people, they did talk about doing it on a light rein, that's not the way it was happening. It was going out of control. So it was a military thing. Steinbrecht says, really eloquently, and I can quote from it, but in that book, but basically Steinbrecht is talking about that all classical riding was based on getting the horse to carry the weight of the haunches, to take the weight off of the shoulders. And matter of fact, it's easy to be found. I'll just read the one paragraph here. Where's that? Okay, so Steinbrecht says, I have had horses whose front legs were completely worn out, but whom nature had endowed with strong hindquarters, and I have given them such complete freedom in the shoulder and such reliable gaits by bending their haunches that they could compete with the best and most valuable of their species. Under former riders, their strong hindquarters had merely helped push all the weight toward the forehand with great force, with such overloading ruining the forelegs in a short time. By taking the load from the forehand, these horses gradually regained their natural elasticity and agility, and the higher elevation of the neck also gave them increased action of the shoulders. To me, that's like brilliant, Parrot. That really says that's the lineage. That's what was happening since the Renaissance, Pignatelli's school, Naples. That's what always happened. Get the weight back on the hindquarters, and that was the collection. Relieve the front end. It's an ethical way, and lift the back of the horse. So the School of Hanover comes along, and they say, Seeger warns them. He's warning them that the military is getting too much influenced by Boucherism or Boucher's tactics, pulling the horse's head from side to side, and he's really worried about it. And he writes a book, scathing book about Boucher's methods. But the cavalry is already doing this now. What's really interesting to me is you have these two things. And Steinbrecht says, look, he says the difference between the cavalry is all they want is the horse balanced a little bit on the forehand. They don't need the horse to do collection, But I think Steinbrecht would be rolling over in his grave if he would have realized how this got out of hand, this deep riding, this long and low riding, and how did it get so much power? How is it so powerful today? Now that becomes that's part of the story, but it's sort of a different chapter. But in any case, it comes about a very specific subset of German riders in the cavalry who start riding the horse, searching for truffles, riding the horse's head down.
And why? I hate to interrupt there, but why? Like, what are they seeing as the function?
I think some of them could have thought that it was to stretch the horse's back out a little bit, to stretch the horse out, but it's not really clear, because they often say, if the horse now starts leaning on the bit, you must ride it more forward. Nobody explains how riding it more forward is possibly going to get the forehand up. So they really had just bad education.
And we see that a lot, right? The idea of sending bad balance more forward.
Right. Oh, today it's very common. Yeah, it's extremely common, and it comes from that initial set of school. They weren't. They say even the School of Hanover, they're not interested in collection. They were interested probably in just military riding. If the balance was a little more on the forehand, who cared? They were never going to do collection. They weren't interested.
Because the aim in the military riding is to keep the guys alive, basically, right? Yeah. If you're preparing horses and men for military, you've got a very disciplinary, and I can imagine this, right? That you've got a very
Yeah.
disciplinary mindset in there that you got to bring these guys back alive,
Right.
right? And that's the vehicle that they're taking into battle.
Right. So, yeah, I think that's kind of, well, it didn't have to be too sophisticated. That's also often leads into the argument about, people say, well, like to say that the high school movements are representations of battle movements, but this just what we're talking about is kind of a proof that is ridiculous, because how long would it take a horse to train a capriole? And then these guys can't even ride, walk, trot, canter, and you're going to go in the middle of a battle and do a capriole? It
Right.
makes no
It
sense
seems
at
like
all.
too high of an attrition rate for
Yeah.
those war vehicles to spend that much time. Yeah.
Right. You would, it's more likely that what people saw is the horse doing that, stallions out in the field breeding mares or fighting with other stallions, that there you saw caprioles, or you certainly would see levades and fighting and so on, and piafs and
Right.
passages. So there were more representations of horses in excited states in natural places. In any case, though, so long and low, the first time you see it in the history of the world is at the School of Hanover, and it becomes this, bringing the horses heads down on command, and not worrying. They said they didn't care about the hindquarters. Now, I have a little demonstration. I do this at all my clinics, and I take this thing. I'll apologize for this. It's kind of silly, but for thousands of years, and I have here Weyrother. I don't know if you guys can see him. Weyrother on this rule, okay? And there were two. Basically, there are two fulcrums, and that's what the middle of the book is about, is the two fulcrums. For thousands of years, the main fulcrum was the LS joint, or the psoas, and the horse then would collect. You would get the horse's weight to come on the hindquarters and lighten the forehand. So I often do this with two sawhorses, and then I can attach the sawhorse to the board, and you see when you push the weight down here, you can actually lift the front sawhorse. So there's some effort involved to make the people understand that there's some effort. Now, the question is, what I ask them all the time is, when you engage the haunches, does our friend Weyrother go up or down? Okay. So now it's level. And now is it going up or down?
Right. He's going up. Yeah.
He's going up. So the back is lifted. That's what the collection feels. Now, when you're going to the collection, a lot of times that lifting of the back is a form of compression. It's a contraction of the muscles of the back, as it would go all the way maybe into a levade. So you would have complete lightness of the forehand by the hind end taking all of the weight. So it's a contraction. Now, many riders today, they have been trained, when they feel that contraction, they panic. And the first thing they do is, oh no, drop the horse back down, ride it forward. So they put on it. Now, here comes the 1800s, and the School of Hanover says, no, we're not interested in collection anymore. We want the horse, like Boucher says, balanced over 4 feet to move more like a spider. We don't care about collection. We don't like it. So now we have the fulcrum now at the withers, and now the head and neck goes down. And now the question is, and this is where almost every one of these things jumps to the wrong conclusion. Does Weyrother go up or down?
You can see his seat comes up.
He comes up. And that right there is the seduction. That people thought, how can it possibly be wrong if I lower the neck and get the back to come up? And it would take really, it takes hundreds of years before you get to somebody like this, finally a scientific study like this famous German woman and McGreevy. And McGreevy says, about talking now, we're jumping ahead, but to basically to the Rolker and the deep riding. And he said, of these studies, 88 indicated that hyperflex negatively impacts welfare via airway obstructions, pathological changes in the neck structure, impaired forward vision, stress, and pain. Based on the review, wrote Koenig von Borstel, the presumed gymnastic benefits of training horses in a hyperflexed head and neck position are by far outweighed by undesired gymnastic effects and reduced equine welfare. Now, the co-author of this, McGreevy, says 23% of the study suggested hyperflexion has negative influences such as a reduced oxygen supply and increased activation of the lower neck muscles. Then, quote, the neck muscles are being trained in an undesirable way, said McGreevy. You are strengthening the underline, not the top line. You don't have to know any of the muscles. You don't have to know any of that. All you have to know is when you're doing that, you're training the wrong side of the neck. People often think that when they lower the neck, somehow that is relaxation. But in fact, muscles only work through contraction. So when you're lowering that neck and curling that neck in, what you're doing is really activating the muscles on the underside of the neck to the point where if you really restrict them enough, the horse cannot swallow. The movement becomes really effective because what it is it's like submission holds in jiu-jitsu. The horse gives up.
Yeah.
You train it into a complete submission because it can't even swallow. So
Mm-hmm.
it
Sort of that
becomes very
learned helplessness that we hear about.
learned helplessness, exactly, a very strict form of aversion training. So anyway, that's what it devolved to. But it begins here in the 1800s when they start riding the horses' heads down, and the riders start bending the horses' heads from side to side. Boucher is using flexions, to bend the horse head, and you're getting the submission. The submission seems to be effective. It is effective, but the seduction is that I have lifted the back up. The problem is that when we do that and we, bring the head and neck down, you completely unload the hindquarters. So the unintended consequences are you are doing nothing to develop the musculature for collection. In fact, what you're doing is you're hindering it. You're actually making it worse. The horses are stiffer across the top line. They don't have any, the psoas can't engage. You're making it weaker, and this horse has become stiffer and weaker and then helpless about learning collection. So that was the middle part of that book, is to show, historically, as you know, you can read the book and find the historical lineage, but then the war of the fulcrums is really the schism in the Germanic riding and around the world. Then we come to the part then where we can talk about, well, how did long and low get so much power? If it's really a kind of, really not a lightweight among riding training techniques, when you had all these other people with such superior skills and so on, how did it get so much power? And then that's where it sort of gets interesting, because there we have the dissolution of the world's cavalries. And now all of these cavalry guys are out of a job. Now, the brilliant ones think what we've got to do is we've got to convince the public to take over the riding, because we don't have any more soldiers. We need to get people to ride. So Gustav Rau is a brilliant strategist in terms of, how do we convince people to ride? We got to get everybody, Germany, on a riding horse. We got to get everybody in the world on a riding horse, and it better be a German horse. It better be a Warmblood. And they were very successful. So, but who does he place after some stinging losses in 1928? Who does he place in charge of this School of Hanover? The famous School of Hanover we're talking about is Otto Lürke. And then one by one, you see all the people that involved in this were all not trained classicist dressage. They were all trained military. So they all came from the same school. They had no problem with the School of Hanover's putting the horses down deep, riding them down deep. Von Neindorf and even like somebody at Klimke would let the horses go down deep in a stretch, whatever. But that was at the end of the ride or before the ride. It was not the system of riding consistently.
So what you're talking about, because I'm sure that this is a question that other people have, and it's a question that has been asked to me prior to our talk here. What you're talking about is the idea of holding the horse in that frame as kind of as part of the work, right? As part of the working frame. You're not talking about, okay, we're giving the horse a break within the work. They reach, they stretch, they blow out, things feel good. Then we come back to work, we come back to contact. That's a separate story than the long and low piece.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and then it became, when the first person you begin to see this you see it with Nicole Uphoff, this young woman riding this horse Rembrandt, and it becomes the darling of the press and the world, because it's this light horse and whatever. But people all of a sudden are getting suspect of how is she training this horse, because they see her in practice and she's doing something that looks pretty abusive, and that she's holding the horse's head down for long periods of time and bending him from side to side. Now, I quoted the articles in the press and so forth. She denies this repeatedly and says that and even Harry Bolt, this famous Harry Bolt, says, no, she doesn't do it all the time. It was only for one instance. The horse was going to shy at something. She corrected it, maybe a little severely, but she corrected it to solve the problem.
The same sort of, it was just a moment in time that we hear about all the bad photos that come out, the bad video clips. Just
it's
a
not
moment
pervasive.
in time.
It's only one time. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us and for the truth, is that an American woman, Beth Baumert, and now how the people at Aachen let this happen, I have no idea, but they gave her permission to come and film the warm-up of all these famous riders. Now, in my past life or whatever, I used to be president of the DVCTA, and an organization that put on dressage at Devon and the Chesterland 3-day event at that time. And I remember we didn't allow photographers to do it willy-nilly. We wanted them to pay. We needed to make money for our show. So we certainly,
Oh,
and
sure.
I think probably Beth had to pay them something, but it was like, they're fooling with your brand. You have to be careful about having people film stuff. Now we
Mhm.
know better about it, but at the time we didn't. In any case, she goes there and films, and now as she has told me, she didn't go there to make somebody look bad. She just went there as an American who wanted to find out how are the Europeans training their horses. So
Yeah, and it's a learning experience. If they're riding and training to the ideals, what an amazing opportunity that would be.
right. So
Yeah.
she films this, and then unfortunately, she films Nicole Upoff for, 40 minutes of holding the horse's head down, and then the other way. And then when she says that was an aberration, she does it again on another horse. Now, then it comes, now the press is going wild. The public is getting really upset about this. But in the meantime, she's still winning. The judges have no problem with this, and they're not going to take into account the methodology of the training. They're just going to talk about the results. Now, I'll segue here because I think this was the moment in time where it could have been different. What you could easily see with Rembrandt was same with our silly little ruler in Weirother, was that they were training the horse onto the forehand, that the horse had no training for collection, and that was Rembrandt's tremendous weakness. He could not sit. He never sat in the piaffe. He never sat even in the passage. There was no collection. It was just this rhythmic, and it was a presentation with a pretty girl on a horse, and that's what they were selling. But the judges could have stopped it then and there, saying like, and they would say to me personally, they have said this to me, Paul, all we can judge is what's in front of us at the moment. We can't judge what happened in the warm-up arena. But my feeling was, that's right. You could have seen it. You could have seen it, that that level of training shows up in the performance. The horse
Because the
can't
proof is in the
sit.
pudding.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you could have stopped then and not given a horse 8s and 9s on piaffe and passage. And then people would have thought, okay, we're losing collection. We could bring it around. But they didn't. They continued only and it got even worse than with Isabel Worth riding, doing the same thing. And then Inke van Grusen. The interesting thing is, to blame this on a 20-year-old woman is ridiculous. She didn't come up with this on her own. She learned this from Uwe Schultenbaumer, who was a jumper rider and a trainer, not a dressage rider. His kids were, kind of famous, but again, Schultenbauer came from riding his commandant's horses on weekends or whatever. He came through the military establishment. He had no problem with the horses going in draw reins or from jumper techniques and so on. So it's this constant lineage of the military system, and it's linked in with winning. So Gustav Rau knows that the really way to promote these horses is that they have to win. So he puts Otto Lorke in charge of the School of Hanover, and he says, now start producing winners. And they do, but there's a fault in them. There's this consistent fault that these horses are losing collection. They're going way away from dressage, and they're riding them. They're becoming more and more abusive. Then Enke van Gruchen shows up, and they just change the name. Instead of saying Rolker, they just call it long, deep, and round, and they say it's not a problem. FEI at a certain point, and again, it's easier for people to read this, but so after like the FEI is basically silent on us. They're really putting their heads in the sand. They're not going to address this. Now this is going on for a long time, decades of this deep riding, this Rolker, this long, deep, and round. And the FEI comes out with a statement. The FEI will establish a working group headed by Dressage Committee Chair Frank Kemperman to expand the current guidelines for stewards to facilitate the implements of this policy. The group agreed that no changes in the rules are required. They're talking about this business of the Rolker, long, deep, round. Then they come up and they make this statement. 7 years later, nothing is done, and this is the statement. There are no known clinical side effects specifically arising from the use of hyperflexion. However, these are serious concerns for the horse's well-being if the technique is not practiced correctly. The FEI considers hyperflexion in any equestrian sport as an example of mental abuse. The FEI states that it does not support this practice. If you read that paragraph, you cannot come up with any other way to describe what that means, except the FEI is saying that there is a correct way to practice mental abuse. That's what they're saying, and
Right.
It's like, who wrote that? I mean, they should have had their editor on that one, but
Right.
they were believing that. They had gotten, to believe that somehow this process of doing this to these horses was mental abuse, but it could be done correctly. And that's where
And
I
it was
think
quite the wordsmith that had to come up with that.
yeah, really. I mean, it's a haiku for God's sakes, you know. But in any case, this was the problem: is that the FEI and the judges who were all embedded in the FEI and were following those rules weren't going to take a stand on this. And so the result is for those three riders alone, who were three of the most sort of famous proponents of this kind of riding, they won over 100 medals in FEI competitions, most of them gold and silver. Now, my question was, what are you going to tell children? What are you going to tell young riders, right? And that, some people tell me, it's about education. You got to educate the riders. How are you going to educate the riders when they see that these three riders over 10, 20, 30 years have won all the gold and silver medals? How are you going to tell them that what they're doing is wrong? Right now, that is something, that's the problem. That's the disharmony that it's not for me, but somebody else has to come up with. And in a way, the FEI has to answer for that. Then the judges have to answer for that.
Right.
That they can't just be quiet and say that they are not part of this problem, and this problem occurred, just by itself. It has I tried to do through this book was to, channel, my own indignation, but to show the facts of where did this come from, who did it, how it's going, how it devolved into the situation, and then maybe make the slightest, suggestions of how it might be corrected. But right now, it's a mess, and this. The animal welfare people are. How did we get to the point where we turn something which was an art form that I loved and studied all my life into something that is constantly under scrutiny for abuse and for welfare, thing, and blood rules and so on. So it's quite disheartening, and I just thought I need to do something, and I'm not powerful enough, and so I do what I always do. I write another book.
There you go. Well, it was, it again takes me back to a quote from Charles de Cunfee about that. He would say that there's no riding in neutrality. You're either building it up or you're breaking it down. And the way that you're talking about the system, the judging, the media, all of it, it's the same, right? It's either going to be built up or it's going to be broken down. And whether we're talking about the horse or the idea that this is a way of riding, right? That needs to be broken down to build back up in the, as you said, the education, right? That these things should be educational for riders. And yeah, when you talk about the collection and not seeing the collection, when you've got, the Piaffe and Passage where the hawks are hidden back in their tail, back in the, it looks like some of them are still in the warm-up ring. And the, when it looks like you could drag the arena with the horse's sternum as they're going around, I think that's the opposite of collection, right?
Yeah.
And yet, and obviously I'm, overcooking that idea. I'm dramatizing it, but not really a whole lot.
Not a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. It's incredible that it's scoring as high as it's scoring. And when you talk about that's what they're supposed to learn from, well, okay, now what are we going to do now that they've learned that?
Yeah. No, and you'll go and someone will bring me a video and tell me to watch a video of this amazing new horse or whatever, and it's doing, and then you'll go to watch the Piaffe, and then the hind legs are stepping on each other, or one's swinging off to the side. And this is the element, these are some of the fundamental elements that you should have learned early on in your career, that you watch for those mistakes. Though that shows when the hind legs are not, supporting weight like that, that's where they get those aberrations. And even though the evasions might be very complex biomechanically, the horse is not sitting or not. No, even when you see squatting down on the haunches, Steinbrück said it so eloquently. That doesn't mean that the horse is sitting or carrying weight. So those get to be more technical problems. But there are really good riders, and there were also, I don't want to say that there weren't good. There were good examples of horses that were doing it well, but they were not winning. So there was always there was this inextricable link between winning. If you want to win, then you're going to have to do it this way, because that's how they're doing all this winning. And if you're an ambitious person and maybe you have resources or whatever, why are you going to copy a way that's not winning? You're going to copy the way that's winning. Those horses will increase. There's tremendous value. Your sales in your barn will go up. Everything, your life will improve, and so on. But the horse's life will not improve. the horse's life will become worse.
Absolutely. And I think that then we're taken back into the idea that we need to understand the theory, right?
Yeah.
I was at a show recently. I've watched replays of freestyles at dressage shows, but only recently did I actually sit down in person and watch a freestyle. And and it wasn't all bad. But what I found really interesting is the horse that certainly showed the most sit and the most lightness and the most, all the things, when we check off the list, we want the
Yeah.
harmony, we want the lightness, we want the suppleness, we want the, by any of the names, we want
Yeah.
these things, also had, unfortunately, enough technical errors
Mm.
that it didn't win.
Yeah.
I believe it came in second or
Yeah.
third, but what won was a horse that didn't have the technical errors, but was being brooded around, and did not have, maybe had the beginnings of trying to learn a piaffe inside the system that wasn't going to teach it a very good one, wasn't going to
Mhm.
help it develop a very good one, but it wouldn't have been a piaffe you'd want to go show off to the world. And yet won because it didn't have the technical errors, right? One of
I
the
think
things that I always find fascinating when I'm watching competitive riders is when a horse has an error. For me, what I'm looking at is an error to what edge,
Mhm.
right? And when I see a horse that makes an error and there's an assumption of more sit or more relaxation,
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind being the rider that has that error,
Yeah,
right?
that would be a
But when you
nicer
see the
problem.
errors that are explosive, that
Yeah.
are, that now you're bulging all the muscles that you've got, you look like a power lifter out there trying to fix these errors. That's as one of the guests on my podcast a couple of years ago made a comment. She said, "That's not my dressage."
Yeah. Well, it wasn't a lot of people. I mean, it starts off, if you go back 2000 years, Xenophon said anything forced can never be beautiful. The point is,
Exactly.
yeah, what we're trying to do is very difficult, but it doesn't mean that when we talked at the beginning of our interview, maybe you're working up a sweat or something. That doesn't mean that it has to turn into abject force or cruelty. That just
Right.
means that you're trying hard, and to learn something difficult, you repeat and repeat and repeat, and you practice and you practice and you practice to get it, But
Hmm.
there's a difference, But I was laughing to myself when you're describing, this whole show you were the freestyle, because I was going to interrupt you and tell you we must have been at the same show, because it was last weekend, and I saw this performance you saw. I must have. It was the exact same thing that happened. So either it's very common, or we're
Right?
going to the same places. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be so, facetious, but sometimes the only thing you
Well,
can
yeah,
do is laugh, because it's otherwise you would be, it's too sad.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, um, of course, the recommendation to everyone to read the book, and I want to be really respectful of your time, Paul, but
Okay.
what do you see? And maybe we don't have an answer for this, right? But what do you see as being an answer? How do we change this? How do we get this back?
I I think it always comes down to it does has to come down to education, and then but how I just talked to a woman today who's trying to start a new program about a really earnest educational thing, who has resources and so forth, but it's got to be education. You can't just take the unfortunately so many of the organizations, the GMO stuff, all they did was they just, when they just bought into the German system, they all memorized the training pyramid. They talk about, they incorporate long and low. It's even in the lower level test in our dressage test in USDF.
Mhm.
There's a stretching. So, they didn't have to take it all hook, line, and sinker. They didn't
Mhm.
have to adapt the thing just completely. They could have just stand back, waited a little while, had some other, authorities come in and talk to them. I'll tell you one last maybe story about that in terms of consulting. So one time I was talking to Arthur Carras. Arthur Carras, brilliant rider, chief of this,
Mhm.
head chief rider of the Spanish
Great
riding school,
instructor too.
and
Yeah.
he said, and this is probably personal, but I don't think he would care. So we're driving in a car or whatever, and he says, that one time he was at one of those FEI symposium type things where you have the riders, perform movements, and the judges practice scoring, or they score them, to
Mhm.
show the younger judges how they should be scored or whatever. Cottas said the only reason he was there because his daughter was riding as one of the test riders. So she rides the test, whatever. And then it might have been Nigley. It was one of the top judges or so on there at the time. And he says, "Oh, we have an expert in the audience. Arthur Cottas. What do you think about the two movements?" And Cottas says, "I think you got him wrong. I think the one was better than the other." Now, I'm not saying that's not the point of my story. The point of my story is we left, so we're driving, and I said to him, do you ever, as the chief rider of the Spanish riding school, do you ever get consulted like on, movements or when they're going to talk about rules or whatever? And he said, never. I said, I couldn't believe it. I said, you had never been consulted? Someone from the FEI didn't ask you to come in and review what they were doing? Never. I just thought, there's your answer. Now we talk about education, but you're going to stay with your little troop of these people who are educated or indoctrinated in one specific way, and you're not going to allow outside intervention or outside thought, or you're not really going to allow critical thinking. What you're going to do is you're going to really make sure that these young judges are brainwashed, that when they're
just
learning
talking into an echo chamber.
Yeah. They're learning to judge. What are they going to learn? They're going to watch other warm blood horses to perform. And that's what the older judges are going to tell them. This is what you should be looking for. And very often they're even sales tapes, so it's a industrial machine educating young judges instead of educating them in theory, or forget the breed of the horse. Let's just show them stick animals, but show them what the movement should go like. Go for over the 500 years of classical theory, educate them into what is proper classical dressage, and then you can interpret it any way you want. But you can't just give 9s and 10s to piafs that are not sitting, as you say, horses with their, passaging completely hollow in the back with more exaggerated front end movement and going against almost all of the classical rules. So the way out has to be education, but, it's got to, it's got to be, not me. It's like I'm trying. Somebody, the young people you have to fight for it too. It's like I did it when I was young. You guys fight for it. Come on now, do something about it.
Right. Rally the troops.
Yeah, and I'll help in any way I possibly can. But but it's time now for a movement from young riders and younger riders. And like I said somewhere in the book, you're going to have to choose what kind of riding you want to do. Do you want to just win, or collect a trophy room, or do you want to really learn how to ride, or do you want to learn how to ride the way it was brought, the way it was passed down for at least 500 years? So that's my challenge, and probably you've heard it. I'm sure everyone has heard enough of me blathering.
No, this is great. And again, just to clarify for everybody listening, in case the question comes up, if you've just popped in and you're listening, what we're talking about is the long and low as kind of the training protocol, right? Saying we are putting you in this frame, and come hell or high water, this is the frame you have to perform in for this portion of your work. We're not talking about the great, you've done some good work, let's release you and allow you to stretch and walk out and relax in between. I think about it as the active rest phase when you go to the gym, right? In between reps and sets, you've got an active rest phase, because what you wouldn't want to do is hold the body in contraction.
You can't do that indefinitely, right? Yeah, no, exactly. You work out in this machine, then you catch your breath, whatever, have a sip of water, and then try again, do something else. Yes, so I think that's going to be a convenient argument, between a lot of people who are going to couch their long and low with saying it's just moments of rest. And it's like, well, you're carrying it over to your technique of riding. You're trotting in the stretching circle. You're cantering. You're riding really forward. You're allowing the horse what is a constant refrain in so many of those lessons? The refrain: put your hands down low, ride the horse over the top. You're riding the horse more and more of the forehand. I wouldn't have written that book and be, in a way, so incensed by this. But because I travel a lot, I go to a lot of places, and I go to a lot of barns, and sometimes we buy and sell some horses. And when you go and you look at horses for sale, and you're going to prestigious barn after barn after barn after barn, horses are ridden in draw reins, pulled down, and it's just, and it's violent and it's abusive. And the worst thing is it's dumb. It's like, I'm always saying, I think these riders need to take a basic course in physics first, and then learn how to ride, because what these instructors are asking their students to do is impossible. It will not work. And it's not that the method isn't already shown to you. It's already there. You don't have to invent it. Just go study it, read about it. So
Right. Right. Again, we come back to the theoretical knowledge.
yeah, ride, but read too.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Well, thank you so
Oh,
much, Patrick.
absolutely, Paul. Thank you. I've got a couple just wrap up sort of questions here, if you
Yeah,
don't mind. I didn't tell
no,
you about these going into this because they're
yeah.
usually just the last moment surprise. But um, I'm going to steal a question here from another podcaster named Tim Ferriss. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's got a great question that he asks his guests. And it is, if you had a billboard to print a message on that was big enough for the whole world to see, what would it say?
About riding or about
Not
anything?
anything.
I would say, embrace critical thinking. Learn how to think.
That's a good one. That's big. And that's certainly more than just riding. I love
Yes.
that one. Learn how to think. That's great. What comes to mind as what comes to mind as one of the hardest lessons that you've had to learn in the pursuit of your passion?
Uh, Patience, probably. I
Mm,
didn't have any problem. I think I can work as hard as anybody on the earth, but and I have lots of patience in the training, but maybe not as much patience with myself, you know. So it would be maybe just to, you know, work hard, but also, learn how, like again, back to martial arts, learn how to breathe, breathe, and don't just always hold your breath and go for it all the time. It's like, breathe, and you'll
yeah.
last longer.
Yeah.
It'll work out better. So
There we go.
yeah,
And the patience with yourself. That is a big thing, isn't it?
yeah.
And
I
it's
mean,
always easier to be more patient with someone else than it is with ourselves.
I think so. It's like you got to be careful about the self-criticism. It can be poisonous. It's be critical, but also maybe be realistic. Reward yourself if you look in that way too. Look at your videos, watch your videos, and if you are improving, if it is improving, give yourself a little pat on the back. It maybe comes only in like I was saying, baby steps, but just don't be always super critical, super critical, super critical. The same with the horse, and the same with yourself.
Hmm.
Study, practice hard, but if you're making progress, that's okay. You're doing a good job.
Perfect. Yeah. Good. Good. Okay. What's one thing for riders to work on or think about to make their horsemanship better this week?
There's your seat. Your seat. It's all about your seat.
Mm,
Practice, learn how to sit in good position, because your communication will not come from your hands, or you won't ride from the spur of your hands. The great ones. And if you want to watch somebody who's a master, watch. I'm always saying what I wrote about in the book. And this particularly the one that I look for almost for inspiration. Go find on the Google on the internet. 1994 is Segovia Mantua and Klaus Krisch, and riding the solo ride, the Spanish Rider School. The whole ride, he
mm,
rides with the whip up in one hand, and if the reins in one hand, no spurs, no kicking spurs. He does twos, ones, triple pirouettes, passage, piaffe. It goes on for, I don't know, 12, 14 minutes. He never moves. Okay. That's all. He doesn't need his hands anymore. He doesn't need his spurs anymore. It's on all with his seat. Learn how to ride with your seat.
there you go. And that takes us back to what we talked about at the beginning, right? The stillness inside that
Yeah.
movement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Fantastic. All right, Paul, thank you so much. Again, the name of your newest book, Long and Low, A Revolution in Modern Dressage. If folks want to find out more information about you, where do they get that?
The easiest thing is, as long as you can spell my name, you could just go to our website, and and then there's categories there, for old articles, uh, everything, from training things to book reviews, sales info, all the stuff. But it's all on the website. So you just go to the website and you can find what you want.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again, Paul. This was a great discussion, really eye-opening. And again, for everybody listening, if you haven't picked up your copy of the book yet, Long and Low, A Revolution in Modern Dressage, I highly, highly recommend it. Thank you so much, Paul.
Hey, thank you, Patrick. Okay.